Someone left a comment on the last video that stopped me cold. They said, Jesus talked about hell constantly. That shocked me. Wake up. And here is the thing. They are not entirely wrong. Jesus did use a word, repeatedly, 11 times in fact, across the 4 Gospels. And that word has been translated into your English Bible as the word hell. So on the surface, the comment makes sense. Read your King James Bible and Jesus sounds like a man obsessed with fire and damnation. But here is the question that nobody sitting in those pews ever thought to ask. Which word did he actually use? In what language? And what did that word mean to the people standing directly in front of him on a hillside outside Jerusalem 2,000 years ago? Because when you answer those 3 questions, when you go back to the original manuscripts and read what was actually written, everything changes. And it starts not in the Bible at all. It starts in Norse mythology. It starts with a goddess named Hel. The word hell does not come from the Bible. It comes from Norse mythology, and almost nobody who uses it knows that. Before we open a single scripture, before we look at a single Greek or Hebrew word, we need to talk about where the English word hell actually came from. Because this is the foundation everything else rests on. And it has been hidden in plain sight for centuries. Because this is the foundation everything else rests on, and it has been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The word hell first appears in written English around 725 AD. It comes from the Old English words hell and hella, and those words trace directly back to the Proto-Germanic root haljo, which meant a concealed place, a covered place, the underworld. That root gave rise to words across every branch of the Germanic languages. Old Frisian Hella, Old Saxon Helia, Old High German Hella, Gothic Halja, Old Norse Hel. And in the Norse tradition, Hel was not a concept. She was a person. In the Norse mythological universe, Hel was a goddess, the daughter of Loki, the trickster god, and the giantess Angrboda. She was the sister of the Fenris wolf and the Midgard serpent, and she ruled over the realm of the dead, a cold, misty underworld called Niflheim, where those who died of illness or old age, those who did not fall gloriously in battle, went to spend eternity. In the Norse mythological universe, Hel was a goddess, the daughter of Loki, the trickster god, and the giantess Angrboda. She was the sister of the Fenris wolf and the Midgard serpent, and she ruled over the realm of the dead, a cold, misty underworld called Niflheim, where those who died of illness or old age, those who did not fall gloriously in battle, went to spend eternity. Her realm was not a place of punishment. It was not a place of fire. It had no moral dimension whatsoever. You did not go to hell because you sinned. You went to hell because you died quietly, in a bed, instead of on a battlefield with a sword in your hand. It was simply the default destination of the unremarkable dead. Now, when Christian missionaries spread into Anglo-Saxon England, they faced a problem. They needed a word for the realm of the damned. The closest word available in Old English was hell. The missionaries borrowed it. They baptized a pagan goddess's name, stripped away her mythology, and grafted it onto a Christian concept of divine punishment. That borrowed word eventually made it into the King James Bible, published in 1611. And the translators used it to translate 4 completely different words. Now we open the manuscripts, and this is where the story becomes something that cannot be unseen. Your English Bible uses the word hell across both the Old and New Testaments as though it refers to one consistent place, one unified concept, one coherent doctrine that runs from Genesis to Revelation. It does not. What it actually does is use one English word to cover 4 radically different original words from 2 different languages, describing 4 completely different ideas. Let us look at each one. The first word is Sheol, written in Hebrew as Shavel. It appears 65 times in the original Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament, 65 times. And in the King James Bible, it is sometimes translated as hell, and sometimes translated as the grave, by the same translators in the same Bible, with no consistent rule for which they chose. What does Sheol actually mean? Simply this: the grave, the pit, the place where the dead go, all the dead, every dead person, righteous or wicked, beloved or despised, patriarch or pagan. Sheol is not a place of punishment. It is not a place of fire. It is not a place of judgment. It is death itself, understood as a destination. The book of Psalms describes Sheol as a realm of silence and unconsciousness. Psalm 6 says there is no remembrance of God in Sheol. Ecclesiastes says the dead know nothing. Isaiah speaks of Sheol as a place of stillness where kings and servants alike are laid low. And then there is Genesis 37:35. Jacob, the great patriarch, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, has just been told that his son Joseph is dead. And he says, in the original Hebrew, "I will go down to Sheol mourning my son." Your King James Bible renders that verse this way: "I will go down into hell mourning for my son." Jacob, going to hell because his son died. Read that again slowly. The translators knew this was absurd, so elsewhere in the very same Bible, when the word Sheol appeared in a verse about a righteous person, they quietly changed the translation to the grave. When it appeared in a verse about the wicked, they wrote hell. They were not translating. They were editorializing. They were building a doctrine into the text that the original Hebrew never contained. The second word is Hades, written in Greek as Hades. It appears 11 times in the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, and it is the direct Greek equivalent of the Hebrew Sheol, the place of the dead, the grave, the underworld in its most neutral sense. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, Sheol was consistently rendered as Hades. The two words were understood to mean the same thing. Jesus uses Hades 4 times in the Gospels, and each time, the King James Bible translates it as hell. Consider what that does to the meaning. In Matthew 16:18, Jesus says to Peter, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Your KJV reads, "The gates of hell shall not prevail against it." But Jesus is not promising victory over a torture chamber. He is promising victory over death itself. The grave will not hold what God is building. That is a resurrection promise, not a threat about Satan's domain. And crucially, Hades is explicitly temporary. The book of Revelation, chapter 20, verse 13 says that death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. Verse 14 says that death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. Hades itself, whatever it is, ends. It is destroyed. It is not the final destination. It is an intermediate state that will one day cease to exist entirely. You cannot build a doctrine of eternal hell on a word that the Bible itself says will be thrown into the fire and destroyed. The third word is Tartarus, written in Greek as Tartaros. And here the story becomes almost embarrassing for the traditional doctrine. Tartarus is the actual Greek word for the deepest pit of the underworld. It comes not from Hebrew scripture, not from Jewish theology, but from Homer and Hesiod, from Greek mythology, from the same tradition that gave us Zeus and Athena and the gods of Olympus. If the writers of the New Testament believed in a place of eternal human torment, Tartarus is the word they would have used. It was sitting right there in the Greek language, fully loaded with the meaning they would have needed. They used it exactly once, in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, and it refers not to human sinners, but to fallen angels being held in chains of darkness until the day of judgment. Jesus never uses this word, not once, not in a single gospel. The man who supposedly preached about hell more than anyone in the Bible never once reached for the one Greek word that actually meant what the doctrine of hell describes. And now we come to the fourth word, the one Jesus actually used. The word is Gehenna, written in Greek as Gehenna, derived from the Aramaic Gehenna, which itself comes from the Hebrew J ben Hinnom, meaning the valley of the son of Hinnom. Gehenna appears 12 times in the New Testament. Jesus uses it 11 of those 12 times. And unlike Sheol, unlike Hades, unlike Tartarus, Gehenna is not a mythological concept or a theological abstraction. It is a place on a map. The Valley of Hinnom curves around the southwestern and southern edges of Old Jerusalem. It sits just below the city walls. It is still there today. You can visit it. You can stand in it. You can look up at the walls of the old city rising above you and understand exactly what Jesus' audience saw when he pointed toward it. In the centuries before Jesus, the Valley of Hinnom had a history so dark that it became synonymous with cursedness itself. The Hebrew kings Ahaz and Manasseh, among the most reviled rulers in Israel's history, had used this valley as a site of child sacrifice. Children were burned alive here as offerings to the Canaanite god Moloch. The prophet Jeremiah stood in this valley and cursed it, renaming it the Valley of Slaughter, prophesying that God's judgment on Jerusalem would make it look like the valley itself. King Josiah, in his religious reforms, desecrated the valley deliberately. He filled it with human bones and made it ritually unclean so that it could never again be used for sacrifice. And in its defiled state, it became something else. It became the city dump. By the time Jesus walked the streets of Jerusalem, the Valley of Hinnom was where the city threw everything it wanted to destroy. Animal carcasses from the temple sacrifices, refuse, sewage, the bodies of criminals deemed unworthy of proper burial. Fires burned there continuously because that is what you do with a garbage heap the size of a valley. And where the fires did not reach, maggots worked instead, consuming what the flames had not yet touched. The smoke rose from it every day. The smell reached the city walls. Every person in every crowd that heard Jesus speak knew exactly what Gehenna was. It was a garbage fire. Now hear the verses again, with that knowledge alive in your mind. Matthew 5:22. Jesus says, "Whoever says to his brother, 'You fool,' will be liable to the Gehenna of fire." He is not invoking a supernatural underworld. He is pointing at a smoldering valley his audience can see from the hillside where he is standing. He is saying, this path, the path of contempt and cruelty toward other human beings, leads to the rubbish heap. It leads to the place where things that have no value are thrown away. Matthew 10:28. Jesus says, "Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna." The Greek word translated destroy is apollumi. It means to perish, to vanish, to be annihilated, not to be tortured in perpetuity, to cease, to be destroyed as completely as a body thrown into the fires of the valley. Mark 9:43, Jesus says, "If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better to enter life maimed than with two hands to go to Gehenna, to the unquenchable fire." And here, unquenchable does not mean burning forever. It means a fire that cannot be put out before it finishes its work. The fires of the Valley of Hinnom were unquenchable in exactly that sense. You could not go down there and extinguish them. They burned until there was nothing left to burn. 4 completely different words, 4 completely different meanings. One translator collapsed them all into a single English word, and that word came from a Norse goddess. The man responsible for that collapse had a name, Jerome, a scholar, a theologian, a linguist, and in the late 4th century, the man commissioned by Pope Damasus to produce a definitive Latin translation of the Christian scriptures. That translation became known as the Vulgate, and for over 1,000 years it was the only Bible most of Western Christianity ever knew. Jerome worked from both the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. He was a capable scholar who understood the distinctions between these words. And yet he rendered Sheol, Hades, Tartarus, and Gehenna, all of them, with a single Latin term that carried connotations of the underworld, fire, and punishment. Before Jerome, a reader of the original manuscripts encountered 4 distinct concepts requiring thought and interpretation. After Jerome, there was one word and one image, and that image was fire forever. The Vulgate became the official Bible of the Western Church. Every sermon preached in medieval Europe drew from it. Every doctrine of hell constructed in those centuries. Every painting of the damned writhing in flames. Every deathbed confession wrung from a terrified peasant. Every coin paid for an indulgence to shorten a loved one's suffering. All of it traced back through Jerome's Latin to a set of original words that did not say what Jerome's translation implied. And when William Tyndale produced his English translation in the 16th century, and when the King James translators followed a century later, they inherited Jerome's framework. They had access to the original Greek and Hebrew, but the theological tradition was already so entrenched, the doctrine of eternal hell so embedded in the institution of the Church, that translating Sheol as simply the grave, or leaving Gehenna untranslated as a place name, felt like heresy. So they wrote hell, all 4 times, every time, without distinction. The King James Version is, to this day, the only major English translation that renders all 4 of those words as a single word. Modern translations like the New International Version, the New American Standard, and the New Living Translation reserve the word hell only for Gehenna and Tartarus and translate Sheol and Hades differently. Even the translators know something went wrong. They have been quietly correcting it for decades, but the damage, the doctrine, the fear, those remain. One man's translation in the 4th century did not just shape Christian doctrine, it shaped 1,000 years of human fear. Now we arrive at the question that honest scholarship cannot avoid. If Jesus was using the word Gehenna, pointing at a garbage dump outside Jerusalem, what was he actually trying to say? What did he mean? The first position is that Jesus was using Gehenna as a vivid local metaphor. When he pointed at it, he was not making a claim about the afterlife. He was making a claim about consequences. This is where a life turned against love and justice ends up. Discarded, reduced to ash, worth nothing. It is the language of prophets, not the language of eschatology. The second position is annihilation, that Jesus was describing a real final destruction, the permanent end of existence for those who reject the life he was offering. The Greek word apollumi, used in Matthew 10:28, means to perish, to be destroyed completely, not to suffer forever, to cease. Life was a gift, and its withdrawal was the consequence of turning away from its source. On this reading, Gehenna is not eternal torture. It is the final fire, the one that completes the destruction and leaves nothing behind. The third position is the traditional one, eternal conscious torment, the doctrine most Christians have inherited. But even here, honest scholarship requires a note. This reading did not emerge naturally from the Hebrew context in which Jesus spoke. It required an assumption that the original Jewish audience did not share, the Greek philosophical idea that the soul is inherently immortal, that it cannot die, that it must go somewhere forever regardless of what God might choose to do with it. That idea comes from Plato, not from Moses. It was imported into Christian theology as Gentile converts brought their philosophical framework with them, and it fundamentally changed what the words of Jesus were heard to mean. If the soul cannot die, then Gehenna cannot mean annihilation. It must mean ongoing experience. And so a garbage dump became a torture chamber, and a word meaning to perish became a sentence of eternal conscious suffering. And the Platonic immortality of the soul became the engine of one of history's most powerful institutions of control. Eternal hell was not built from what Jesus said. It was built from Greek philosophy, a Norse goddess, and one man's 4th century translation. Here is what most people do not know, and what the Church, for obvious reasons, has never been eager to advertise. The earliest Christians, the ones closest in time and culture to Jesus himself, did not generally believe in eternal conscious torment. The first systematic statement of Christian doctrine ever produced, written by Clement of Alexandria around 180 AD, included universal salvation as one of its core teachings. Clement taught that all punishment, however severe, was ultimately purifying in nature, that the fires of judgment were corrective, not retributive, that God's goal was restoration, not revenge. The early Christian catacombs, The underground burial chambers of Rome, where the first believers inscribed their faith on stone, contain not a single inscription supporting the doctrine of endless torment. Every monument, every epitaph, every expression of hope carved into those walls harmonizes with a vision of mercy and restoration. Origen, the most influential Christian theologian of the first 3 centuries, taught a doctrine called apokatastasis, a Greek word meaning the restoration of all things. He believed that the fires of judgment were real, but that their purpose was purification, not punishment for its own sake. That God, whose nature is love, would ultimately draw every soul back to himself. That the story of creation did not end in the permanent loss of most of humanity, but in the healing of all things. Origen wrote, "When death shall no longer anywhere exist, nor the sting of death, nor any evil at all, then verily God will be all in all." Gregory of Nyssa, declared a father of fathers by an ecumenical council, held the same view. He was never condemned for it, and centuries later, Isaac of Nineveh, writing in the 7th century, put it this way: "It is not the way of the compassionate Maker to create rational beings in order to deliver them over mercilessly to unending affliction. As a handful of sand thrown into the ocean, so are the sins of all flesh as compared with the mind of God." For the first 5 centuries, the dominant scholarly tradition held that God's judgment ended in restoration. What changed? Politics, Augustine, power, the needs of an institution that had discovered, by the 4th century, that fear was the most efficient tool of governance ever devised. A God who eventually restores everyone is a God whose mercy you can afford to test. A God who tortures the unrepentant forever is a God whose church you cannot afford to leave. Today, the word hell still echoes from pulpits built on his translation choices. A Norse goddess still haunts the pages. And the garbage dump outside Jerusalem still smells nothing like what it became. They took a garbage dump, a Norse goddess, and a 4th century mistranslation, and built the most powerful control mechanism in human history. And today, if you are watching this, it is probably because some part of you already sensed that something was wrong, that the math did not add up, that a God described as love, who creates beings capable of suffering and then subjects them to infinite suffering for finite choices, is not a God of love at all, that the punishment does not fit the crime, that the story you were handed does not hold together under the weight of honest examination. If the word hell came from a pagan goddess, if the earliest Christians believed in the restoration of all things, what exactly were we afraid of? And today, who still needs you that afraid? This is Unmasking the Gods, the scroll they were never supposed to find. If this found you, leave a comment below and tell me what you were never taught. Subscribe if you are ready to go deeper. And today, share this with one person who is still afraid of a word that came from a Norse goddess, because the truth does not need your fear. It only needs your attention.